Russ Mitchell, who's a staff writer at the LA Times.
Hello. Thank you. The panelists, Phil, Yuri, Karen. It's late in the day, and thank you for hanging out for this. I think it'll be a very good discussion. We were talking a little bit earlier, very intelligent people with lots of interesting ideas. Since it's late, I want to thank John Rossant for putting this conference together. It's the third year, and it just keeps getting better and better. John and his co-author, Steve Baker, will be on stage right after this to talk about the new book, Hop, Skip, Go, which is fabulous. I just finished it the other day, and I highly recommend it. So I'm going to just ask you kind folks to introduce yourselves and just tell us a little bit about what you do, and then we'll start talking.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for sticking around at 5 p.m. on Friday. My name is Phil Silver, and I'm the leader of the transportation vertical in Amazon Web Services state and local government business. And I look after our activities with airports, seaports, tollways, traffic departments, public transit, parking, anywhere where the public sector is making an investment in IT. I'm there to help them understand the power of the Amazon cloud and what we can do to make the life of their constituents better.
Good.
Hi, everybody. We're Tamir from Mobileye, an Intel company. We are the global leader in driver assistance systems, autonomous vehicles, and computer vision-based mapping and localization. And I lead the growth, the North American growth for Mobileye for its data operation and their advanced product.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen, and I came all the way from Brussels in Belgium. I work for Polis, which is a European network of cities and regions working together on sustainable urban mobility and urban transport innovation. So seeing together, learning from each other's mistakes as well as successes, and looking at how we should regulate in order to be able to innovate in a way that makes sense, basically.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Liu. I'm with Parsons Corporation. I came all the way from Pasadena, up the street. I oversee the Smart Cities business at Parsons. We are basically a digitally enabled solutions provider and operate in the critical infrastructure as well as the federal space.
All right. Before we get started on the subject matter, I'm interested in what the big takeaway is for you guys from this year's event, and what you look forward to discussing in the future, next year.
I guess one of the takeaways for me is that there is a space now for big companies, big government agencies, small government agencies to really work together. The technologies, as they're emerging, the mega trends that I'll speak to shortly, don't discriminate. They don't lock out anybody from an opportunity to innovate and bring new ideas to the market.
Right?
Yeah, I think to follow up on what I would just say, I think the main takeaway for me from this 2 days is how different data points and different players in the industry converge together. They come together instead of acting in silo. So I think we see it as a trend in the past few years, where before that you had different, the city or the vehicles or the transit systems or the infrastructure, they all were operated separately. And I think in these 2 days, we saw so many examples of how the data can connect between them.
Great.
Well, it's interesting to see that many of the issues that American cities are struggling with are also the ones that European cities are looking into. While there are still quite a few differences as well, we have a very strong urban public transport backbone in our cities. Maybe that's not entirely the same here. But we also see how both in America and in Europe, the lines between public and private are blurring, that we have all these new mobility services coming to the market, and that cities need to think about how to integrate these systems, these new services into the overall ecosystem that urban mobility is, in a way that it makes sense and is aligned with policy goals, and how to set up new public-private partnerships for that purpose. It's something that we are looking at in Europe as well. And the role of data, of course.
So I think I'll echo a little bit of what Phil mentioned. Is really, I think of Parsons. We've been working on transportation, for 75 years as a company, And we have a lot of experts here, and we're a 20,000 person firm. So what I've really, amazed to see a lot of small 15, 20 person startups where I really see a lot of technologists who don't necessarily have a background in mobility and coming and really disrupting, solving some of the problems. So I think, for us as an industry is really how do we work together with the, large firms who have this experience in the space with the new technologists who can come help us disrupt the way we've done things in a place where we could work with the government together. It's, so I think this has been a great, exciting place for all of us to convene together here at CoMotion.
Great. So on the subject of autonomy, I'm wondering what it is in terms of infrastructure the cities, municipalities, states need to do to prepare. The timeline isn't clear, although it's coming, and it's not just cars, it's going to be buses, trucks, delivery vans. In terms of infrastructure, just basic bright lines on the road that aren't faded out, and smooth roads that don't have potholes would be helpful. I'm interested in what else cities need to do, and also where the money's going to come from, because at least in California, we've still got a lot of holes in the road. I'm wondering how they're going to afford what it's going to take for what promises to be a real revolution in the streets of our cities.
Sure. I'll take maybe
way.
infrastructure. I'll take that first one. I think this is going to evolve quite a bit with time, and looking at how is autonomy going to be adopted at what kind of penetration rate. So, electric vehicles, for instance, have been here for a while, and I think here in California, we're still under 5% penetration, right? So I think definitely today, what we can do already from an infrastructure perspective is autonomy and connected, they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. So, from the perspective of vehicles being connected to the infrastructure, other vehicles, V2X, basically, no matter how good an autonomous vehicle is, it cannot see around the corner or over the hill. So definitely that's an important part of it. Also, just today, yeah, certainly even with just ride shares, and we're seeing different travel patterns, maybe we don't need as many parking spots anymore in the short term. Or maybe, yeah, we do need the brighter lanes, but over time, as we get more and more autonomous vehicles, potentially these 10-foot lane on the highway can become 6 to 8 feet, because it's really going to depend on what rate we're penetrating at. Eventually, the goal is that you one day potentially don't even need streetlights anymore, right? But we're going to always operate in a very complex environment where you have some autonomous vehicles, regular vehicles on the street. So we have to really think about how that evolves over time.
I would take a step back first and point out that first cities need to think about what they expect from automation, whether they want automation, first of all, and if they do, in what way they would allow automated cars to operate on urban roads. I mean, the urban environment is incredibly complicated, not to be compared to interurban contexts. So to have an automated vehicle operate in an urban environment is already quite a challenge. And there's been an optimism bias as to when automation was going to arrive. And I'm not sure when it's actually coming, if at all, in cities. But first of all, and that's what we try to make our cities aware of, think about what you want automation to do in your cities and how it can help you to achieve your policy goals. If you're just going to open your city doors to automated cars from a private car user perspective, it's not going to solve any problems in terms of congestion and so on. So they have to think about this carefully, and maybe first rule would be only automated cars if they're clean and if they're shared. Rule number one. And then, of course, we have to think about all the requirements in terms of infrastructure. And indeed, there are quite a lot of challenges to be addressed in terms of digital infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure, starting with the very basics of fading road markings, of potholes on the streets and so on. And that requires investment and resources, clearly. But the first thing is to be aware of what might be coming our way and then decide how we want to allow automation in the first place.
Great. I don't want to get in the way of what you're saying, but as part of your answer, Mobileye is doing something very interesting called REM, which is basically mapping the streets, not just for traffic, but for pedestrians, for the entire urban environment. And I'm guessing that fits into gathering data on what is needed for autonomous cars.
Absolutely. So we announced about 2 years ago our REM technology. REM stands for Road Experience Management. And it's a mapping and localization technology that we developed originally for the autonomous vehicle, which goes back to the original question. At least our view is that if we would like to make this self-driving systems, autonomous vehicle into an industry, we have to know how to drive in the current infrastructure. Right? We cannot expect to change the infrastructure to fit future autonomous vehicle. And that is what Mobileye is all about, how to drive and to think like the person, because we can drive without knowing what's around the corner. Right? And we can drive on the current infrastructure. So unless the technology can know how to drive that, like that, we might stay as the most expensive scientific research or exploration in history of human being. But we're here to build an industry, right? We're here to build something that will have millions of vehicles. So changing the infrastructure, it takes time, it takes trillions of investment. It will be better if we can use the sensors and could we use the data in order to maintain and have better maintenance for the infrastructure, right? So to locate where the potholes, but also to prioritize the pothole, right? So I live currently in New York City, and if you ever been in New York, you drove on the I-95, or parts of it is just one big pothole, right? And we all know that the budget is limited and takes resources, but if you using the data that you have today, you can prioritize which pothole actually is more important, which potholes you get vehicles drive over it, and which potholes, okay, maybe it's located somewhere where currently is not there. So all this using this REM technology, which we using the already in the vehicle forward-facing camera, we can detect and classify almost every object on the road. And we know the semantic of it, because as opposed to other sensors, camera, you can understand semantic of objects, what it means. Not just a traffic sign, what is written on the traffic sign. And we can learn how to read and utilize the infrastructure in a much better way.
And I'm going to speak to a slightly different kind of infrastructure that actually Mobileye could not accomplish what it does without it, and that's the data infrastructure. We're talking about petabytes of data when we talk about connected. And just to give you a sense, just the BMW group in their autonomous vehicle testing program has used the same amount of data that if you were to pile a stack of CDs 200 miles high, 75 miles past the International Space Station. So there's an infrastructure to support connected vehicles, there's computing at the edge, there's a whole set of infrastructure capabilities that will be enabled by 5G, that will be enabled by DSRC, and all the technologies that allow cars to talk to each other, cars to talk to the environment, entertainment, and the kind of experiences travelers want when they're a car to be delivered to them. And that's an entirely different infrastructure that many cities in the world are not prepared for yet.
Right, and the cloud is very powerful, but it also concentrates the location of information into one private company's hands. So after a city or municipality picks a cloud vendor, how, and I'm interested in everyone's opinion on how you make sure that the commercial end is being taken care of, because that's why you're in business, but also that the public is both secure, private, and something that isn't talked about much isn't overwhelmed by commercialism. Google has, you guys are Amazon's working on maps now. I was talking to a guy earlier today who had Google Maps, and they were out camping, and they wondered what mountain was over the horizon. So he looked up on Google Maps, and it had every business that had mountain in the name, but it didn't have the mountain that he was looking for. With driverless cars, there's more opportunity for sales and advertising, et cetera. So I'm interested, Karen, from your point of view, and then Phil, from the other side, although you're trying to cooperate.
And we're on the
How do
same
you-
side.
Yeah, on the same side. So how do we get to the point where the public is served, but the companies can earn the profit they exist to do?
Yeah, that's a question that links back to what I mentioned before, that the lines between public and private are blurring, but of course the private sector has commercial interests at heart. Fair enough, that's normal. The cities have the public interest at heart, and that again is also in itself a balancing act, because you have on the one hand what the city as a whole needs, what society needs, and then you have what the individual user wants, the consumer wants, and that is not necessarily aligned, and in many cases actually it is not aligned. And to find that balance also between those two, in addition to the balance between public and private, is quite challenging. And unavoidably, from a public sector perspective, that will require a mix of carrots and sticks. We're not just going to get there by offering interesting products, by offering incentives. We will also need rules, regulations, and restrictions. And you know, just to name an example, mobility as a service, people seem to assume that if you offer the user a nice integrated package of different types of mobility services, people will automatically switch to sustainable transport behavior. It doesn't work like that. You'll have to combine it with restrictions as well, access regulations, for example, pricing schemes, and so on. And the same will be the case for automation. You were mentioning all these different services that are available in the car for the consumer to enjoy. And that's the threat at the same time, because if people don't have to drive anymore, they can do all kinds of other things, but that might lead to also an increase in kilometers driven, more trips being taken, longer commuter distances, more urban sprawl. You see, these kind of things we'll have to be aware of that, and we'll have to make sure that we avoid these negative externalities, and that will unavoidably require cooperation and trying to align public with private interests. And if we see a meaningful role for these new mobility services in the overall ecosystem, then we'll probably end up partly subsidizing some of these services in the future as well, as we see is also needed for public transport, for example. But that is only if there is a meaningful role to play for these new mobility services.
Great. Either you guys want to address that one?
Yeah, I just think that you know, a lot of times we see actually, at least in our when we talk to cities or states, we see a lot of aligned interest between what we want to achieve and what the city wants to achieve. I think, and especially, you know, the private sector cannot live without answering on the pain points for the public sector when we work with that. So you can't really separate the interests between what Mobileye, for example, what we do when we offer our solution or product to cities and states, then what's their interest. If we can't answer your pain point, we can sell. So you see a lot of time actually alignment in those interests, but then there's always the question about the data, about the information, right? The ownership of the data, so the right of use in the data, and then you have the GDPR regulation, which try to handle how your rights of use of and ownership of the data, and I think that it's something that is missing, more or less, not actually that regulation, but some kind of an understanding between the private sector and the public sector. What is data? How do you deal with the data? And you know, there's different type of data, right? We can't keep calling it just with one data, because a lot of time there's the data that the public sector is interested in and the data that private sector is interested in, and not necessarily the same.
Andrew, and then Phil.
Yeah, I think, you know, from our perspective, you know, really, the biggest challenge is always how do you fund smart cities or, you know, new mobility projects. And, you know, models like you mentioned, advertising, are things that most cities oftentimes do not want. You know, then it gets into the data monetization side, which comes with its own challenges. So we've really kind of looked at saying, well, you know, what are some of the things that we can do that cities are already, you know, paying for or buying today, and how can we do that more efficiently with technology, right? So our example we're partnered with Phil and Amazon Web Services, a great partner for us, is how do we solve this age-old problem of trying to reduce congestion within the city, right? And we're talking about Parsons. We have people who have for decades gone and retimed these signals, right? And we do this once every 5 years for a city. That's a service that they pay for. How can we actually use computer vision, big data, AI, all these, put it all together in the cloud to come up with a better way of doing that, to be more adaptive, to be more real time, and try to do this on a more value-based, but most importantly, do this for equal or less than what they're already paying for these services today. So I think, the challenges with the new technologies that come in are things that cities do not have budgeted for today. So how can we actually use this new technology to solve some of the problems that they're already paying for today? That's the niche that we're trying to get into, yeah.
Phil.
And as the infrastructure provider, the pipes for all the things that Uri and Andrew have talked about, we have an obligation to enable our partners to meet the needs of their customers with a set of capabilities, a set of analytics, machine learning, IoT capabilities that they can build upon in order to meet the needs of the constituents in ways that simply can't be met otherwise. So our obligation, and we're rewarded by both of your companies, is to provide a safe, secure, reliable, fast, redundant, durable environment. So it doesn't matter if it's raining or if there's an earthquake or if there's a flood somewhere. We continue to serve the needs of the constituents that our customers are serving every day.
You know, something that's very interesting is that when you talk to cities, for example, they have data. A lot of them already have data from many sources. And you ask them questions, what about the pen pods? And they're like, yeah, we have data about that. We collected that. We paid consultants to give us some of the data about things. But then what do you do with it? Right? How do you digest it? And what are the insights that you can get from that? And I think, since this panel, and we talk about the age of automation, right? It's all about the new tools that we have to automate what was previously either you couldn't achieve, or it was just not cost effective to do that, right? So I think one of the, for example, if you ever seen those people outside with the measurements units, measuring different types of the pavement condition, right? It's part of what's called a Pavement Condition Index. It's a survey that every single city, municipality, county in the United States made. And it's an expensive survey, right? So because it's expensive, they take a sample of the road and they do it, let's say, every other year, right? So, and cities and municipalities basically use this PCI, this Pavement Condition Index, to know where they need to repave, where they need to maintain the road. But now you have cameras in vehicles. Now you have millions of sensors traveling on the roads. And if you can automate this collection of the data and create insights and tell the cities, hey, you have crackings on this street and you have potholes here and you need to repaint the landmarks over there, all of a sudden you create new opportunities that weren't possible before that. I know, and this is exactly this layer of IT that you create, that you inject between the infrastructure and the users of a city.
Can I add something quickly? Yeah. I want to provide two examples of where public entities opening up their data delivered incredible benefit. Transport for London, 5 years ago, created an open API to allow people to get to what was 18 siloed data sets. And since then, they have created an environment that has gotten investment from the private sector and produced over 600 apps that feed on that public data and serve the residents of London every day. Waze has a program called Waze Warp, where they expose their data to any public entity that wants to take it in, and the city of Louisville is actually using it now to conduct almost daily traffic studies, where in the past, because they're a small, limited city, they can only do them twice a year. So there is a place, there is an intersection where this data becomes available. It becomes available in the cloud, so it's ubiquitous and in everyone's hands, and cities can do great things with it with our help.
That's the point exactly, that it should serve a purpose. Technology should be an enabler, a means to an end, and that's when cities are interested, when it can help them to solve certain problems. At the same time, we also see that there is a huge need for new skills for capacity building, because all these new technologies, how to handle data, etc., it's new in many cities, and there's also a gap in terms of the people working in the cities being able to handle all these new technologies, and that's something we need to work on as well, and that we are working also on in Europe with the help of funding from the European Commission, for example, helping cities to become automation ready. And that doesn't mean adapting to automation, but also being aware of how they can set the rules of the game and shape their policies in such a way that they determine how and to what extent and when automation can be useful, or any other kind of technologies. But it will require a lot of support tools, also decision support tools, modeling tools that can help them to assess the likely impact of new mobility services, for example. So there's still quite a long way to go. What we do have in Europe is a strong planning tradition. What we promote is the so-called sustainable urban mobility plans, which help cities to adopt long-term and integrated transport visions that also go beyond political cycles and election cycles, which is important. And so there's a lot of European guidance that has been developed in this respect and has just been upgraded as well to incorporate all these innovation areas and to help cities to integrate innovation areas in this urban planning tradition as well, including automation, mobility as a service, shared mobility, electrification. All these different areas are now being tackled also from an urban planning perspective.
I want to agree with you, if I may, around the importance of workforce development. 96% of public sector agencies have indicated that they have a cloud first or a cloud preference strategy, yet less than half of the new systems they acquire are in the cloud. And the reason they most often say is that they don't have the skills yet to deploy in the cloud.
And it is important not to just outsource everything to the private sector where those skills are. They should also have them in-house, also to be aware of what is actually happening and in which direction this is going, to determine this and not just hand everything over to the private sector to do it for them. And then maybe also end up in a vendor lock-in situation. That might also be a problem.
Right. Anybody else? Nope. The idea of people, the businesses that I talk to think that the government and regulators move too slow. The government and regulators think that they wouldn't put it this way in public probably, but that the businesses are too aggressive. And in fact, there's just so much new technology coming through, so many new startup businesses that they're overwhelmed. But somebody talked about consultants, and I wondered what role consultants play. My prejudice is that they're bogging things down and that people are too reliant on consultants, and that they can, with some exceptions, the big consulting companies are very ossified, very set in their ways. I notice there aren't too many at this conference because they know it all already. So, but cities tend to contract a lot of their decision-making out to consultants, and I'm just wondering whether you think that needs to change. I guess you're first, Karen.
Well, I think that links into what I just mentioned, that indeed they should be careful not to outsource everything and need to build this capacity internally to also get a grip on what's happening and steer what is happening. And indeed, it looks like we are currently running behind reality all the time. There's all these innovations coming our way at a very fast pace, all at the same time, and cities are sort of, trying to catch their breath and trying to regulate what is coming their way after it has happened. So we need to move to a situation where they can also anticipate. And with automation being slower than expected, there is an opportunity in the sense that they have more time to anticipate and prepare for it. So that's a good thing. But also we need to make sure that our regulations become more agile and flexible, and also can build in the unknown and can incorporate what we don't know yet today, but what might be coming tomorrow, and that we not each time have to go through a lengthy and painful process of upgrading our regulations based on reality that is kicking in.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I guess, if I look at it, coming from a professional services background, right? So, when I really look at the future of how we deploy solutions, it needs to shift from becoming how do we charge man hours, labor to cities towards an outcomes based, what are you looking for to solve here? Is it a, certain amount of reduction in greenhouse gas or travel time, et cetera? Can we do this performance-based where we're not charging for man hours, we're actually giving you, building in that solution for you? Part of the challenge now, though, is really, I don't think this is a technology barrier for us. I think it really is a regulatory, how do governments buy? And it really comes down to the relationships that you build with individual cities, because I think every human that I talk to in the government agrees this is a better way to do it. But how do we actually go deploy these commercial terms within the constraints that are here? Particularly, if we look at it, they change from country to country, state to state, local municipality to municipality. So it becomes a very tricky issue for us to how we deal with that holistically.
I think pilots are really important as well. Try things out together in partnership with the industry to see what works and what doesn't work. The sandboxing, but also then the next challenge is to go beyond the piloting, because what we see in Europe a lot is we do a pilot, the money's gone, and then off to the next pilot, but there's no legacy, so that's another challenge to address.
So as a taxpayer, I don't really have an interest in the government being the expert in all things. I wanted to keep the lights on, the streets clean. I wanted to make my life easy, and I can't imagine a world, particularly where technology moves so quickly, where the government is going to know more about what's going on in cloud computing or in civil engineering or in autonomous vehicles than those of us who are engulfed in it. Andrew used a word that I think is really important, and as I work with consultants, I'm trying to help them move away from the traditional prescriptive, you'll do this, 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 and this, and instead of being that, we're encouraging them to ask us what the outcome is. What do you want? Do you want to map your streets? Don't tell us how to map it. Find an expert who can do that for you. And then deal with the governance issues. We'll help deal with the data issues associated with that. So, and there are consulting firms that get it and are engaging with their customers, not to tell them exactly what every step is going to be, but what the outcome is going to be. And we're part of providing those solutions for them.
There need to be more of those. And I'd encourage anybody who's hiring the consultants to really do some shopping. Right.
Yeah, consultants, God, you got to love them. But if you want to go take a little bit step back to the main problem here, and I think you touched about it exactly, we can't expect cities or the public sector to be a matter expert on everything for many reasons, but there are built-in mechanisms of how they can overcome them. One of them is a matter expert consultant, right? So a consultant can be a great way to transform the information between the private sector and to public sector. Another mechanism that we all know is called by the RFI. So a city or a state, they need to learn about something, they publish an RFI, and that's how they get information. I could just wish it would take less than half a year before they craft this RFI, but that's something else. There are ways for cities and for public sectors to educate themselves. We also need to take into consideration that naturally, the public sector is more risk-averse. They're dealing with taxpayers' money, so you can't expect the same risk-taking that sometimes you see from the private sector, which is okay, it's acceptable.
Sure. Yeah, and my point wasn't that consultants are unnecessary, because they certainly are. My point was that the industry seems to be changing more slowly, especially with the big companies. And I'm not counting you guys as consultants. I know you do consulting work, but you know the firms I'm talking about. Yeah. Any questions from the audience?
Wow.
Is there somebody taking a mic around? If not, I'll...
I can just yell.
Yeah, sure.
So I work in the aerial space, and for us, there's a huge distinction between autonomous and automated. So, thank you. So full autonomy versus having a human in the loop that is an observer or a pilot, a controller, et cetera. So I'm curious, maybe this is more directed to you, but how do regulatory bodies like Polis feel about that distinction? human in the loop versus full autonomy as it relates to actually integrating these sorts of technologies?
We're not a regulatory body, but so we're a network bringing cities together and helping them to regulate for innovation. But yeah, that's a good question, and I think especially when we're talking about the transition phase, where we don't have full autonomy, but we have some kind of, we have all these different levels where the human factor is still important. I think there are many issues and questions to be resolved when it comes to liability and so on, in case something goes wrong. I don't think we have. I think we have more questions than answers in that respect, and at the moment. So that remains to be seen, because that's a very important factor, especially in the urban environment where you have this coexistence between different types of road users. You have the interaction between automated or autonomous vehicles and other road users, such as pedestrians and cyclists, which is incredibly complex. And actually, for now, I cannot imagine a situation where a fully autonomous vehicle will be able to move at all if you just take the average intersection in an urban environment where you have all these different things going on, where you have so many unwritten rules in the way that different road users interact with each other. How on earth is that vehicle ever going to be able to move? I think it will be, all sensors will be going off all the time. and if you just look at the shuttles that are currently being trialed, and in many cases, it's like a 95-year-old grandmother who's driving, super slow. It's faster to just walk alongside the shuttle. It's stopping all the time whenever it detects something. So I'm a bit skeptical in terms of where it will go. When it comes to airspace, that's another question. And it's a space that cities are not in charge of at the moment. But I think that's another area where definitely they will have to anticipate as well, and where they need to think about what they actually want. Do they want that we don't see the sun anymore because everything's gray and covered in drones and flying taxis and whatever? So there's again a question to be answered in terms of what can these new technologies bring, what can this new dimension add, and what can we solve with it? So, yeah.
Yeah, but by the way, you see the same differentiation in between automation and autonomous also in the on the vehicles. So it's fairly easy to divide the SAE levels of automation into two parts. Let's say, level 0 to 2, it's more automation. Level 3 to 5 is more autonomous, right? And the question is always, how do you address the autonomous, right? The level 4, 5, like this. And you already start to see in the past few years some regulatory, in the US, regulatory deal with it. We have the NHTSA guidelines for autonomous vehicle currently on their third version. But this is definitely somewhere where you would expect, it might be weird talking from a private company like that, but you would expect some more regulation to us to get the directions from the regulators, right? So what is your definition of safety? How do you define safety for autonomous vehicle, right? And I'm not necessarily talking about the ASIL or the engineering terms of safety about failure of sensor. I'm more referring more to the decision-making, the driving policy of a self-driving system. That how do you regulate the safety of these things? How do you define redundancy between those systems? And we do think that this is exactly where regulators, standardization bodies need to step in, and they need to define it for the industry, because we don't want an industry where each company have their own thing.
I can't speak completely for the aerial dimension, but according to IDC, connected vehicle shipments will reach 76 million cars in 2023, and then it'll grow at a compound annual growth rate of 16% from then on. So I think the die has already been cast. I don't believe we're going to see autonomous completely until those fleets of connected vehicles have been deployed. And I would imagine that we'll deal with the same problems in the air once we've deployed fleets of connected drones or flying taxis.
So I'm an engineer by background, but I look at this, I think it's much more of a, also psychological problem as well, right? So human in the loop or not. I mean, you can frame it however you want, and statistically speaking, a fully autonomous vehicle is probably safer than a human driver. There's no debate around that, right? But the psychology around it. So I'll give you one example. Probably only 8 years ago when I first heard about Uber and I was living in San Francisco, I said, this is such a bizarre idea. I don't want to get into some stranger's car, right? And now look how quickly that has evolved, right? And I think that changes over time. I still remember one of the, Shaylin Bod, he's the president of ITS Americas. He talked about it, when the automobile was first invented. It was still the horse and buggy days, and everybody thought this was going to be, you guys are crazy, it's going to kill people, and it just took time for the industry to evolve. So I definitely think whenever it comes to new technology, particularly if there's human life safety involved with it, the huge psychological element of it is, once it becomes to the point where it makes sense economically and you get used to it, then you see it really take off. So I certainly hope to see that come sooner than later and have that confidence without the human.
And to your point, we take so much for granted. 150 years ago, nobody believed that you could provide electricity as a utility. And look what's happened since then.
True. Although the cars did kill people. They kill a lot of people, and we've just decided to make the trade-off. This is a fact.
Yeah, but
time for one more question?
Can I ask, it's really the same basic question, but framed more from where is the investment being made to deal with this interim period we've just referenced between now and the design point of fully autonomous autopilot mode, and how do we make vehicles better sort of co-pilots for all of us in this interim period where that design point actually seems to be receding from us, and it may be, to Karen's point, never actually arrives. So for the Waymos and the Mobileye's and the Optimus Rides and all these AV companies, what investment's being made to help us take advantage of the technology before it's here, if you know what I mean? Like, are there interim stages where we can actually get the advantage of autonomy without waiting for the ultimate level 5 or even level 4?
Absolutely. I think this is what we currently see in the market. Mobileye, we run for 20 years on the driver assistance systems, and the way we see it is a gradual development, right? So we do not design a system just for it to be level 5 of automation. We started with warnings and then got to automatic emergency braking and then adaptive cruise control, and you have the level 2 plus of what we define of different, more advanced ADAS, and we will get there. It's a gradual, and that's how the investment, and we need to add other aspects, such as the mapping. But everything that we do, every piece of technology that we develop for the autonomous vehicle, we only develop it if we think that there is use case today. So the RAM, for example, the mapping, you already see today in some of the advanced model of ADAS, you can see car manufacturers implement the Mobileye mapping together with the driver assistance systems to give you a better features. And you can see us currently taking the data from this mapping and working with states or cities or municipalities. So everything is already happening today in order to bring us to the future of autonomous vehicle.
So today, Ford Motor Company has more data scientists than it has automotive engineers. And this is one of the places where the private sector is, in my view, being a guide to the public sector. Too Simple has an SAE-4 automated truck system that can see 1,000 meters and is accurate to 100 millimeters. That right now is special science, but it won't be for long. And I see the private sector continuing to innovate the way Mobileye does to make these things much more common and easy.
On the question of the transition, I think it's important to recognize that there's going to be a hump between driver assist systems and fully autonomous. Waymo decided to go to level 4 because they never wanted to do level 3. And for those who don't know, level 3 lets you pay attention, lets the car drive itself, but the driver has to be ready to jump in at a moment's notice if a serious situation is involved. Every human factors expert I've talked to said that that's just a recipe for disaster, because anybody who's talking on the phone or reading a book or maybe taking a snooze in a situation that calls for split-second reaction, it's just not going to happen. There's going to be a crash. Level 1, level 2, if you're paying attention, and there are some companies that are marketing level 1, level 2 systems, not Mobileye, they're very responsible. Level 1, level 2 technologies, but pretending that they can do a lot more than they do, and those cars are getting in accidents, and you're seeing them in headlines. So I think once we reach the point where it's almost autonomous, but not quite, that's something that's going to be very challenging to deal with. Okay, thanks everybody.